in the year 1859, a book appeared, far more than just words on a page. It was a spark, a revolution that would fundamentally alter our understanding of life on Earth. It was a challenge to the very foundations of how we perceived our place in the universe. This is the story of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, a story born from restless curiosity and a keen eye for detail, a book that ignited scientific debate, challenged long-held beliefs, and ultimately reshaped our world. Darwin's journey was a profound one. It led him to places far removed from the familiar shores of Britain, places where the very fabric of life was on display in all its bewildering beauty and complexity. And it was here on those rugged coasts and within those teeming forests that the seeds of a radical idea were sown, an idea that would forever change how we see ourselves and the world around us. In the next 25 minutes, we'll explore Darwin's revolutionary ideas, breaking down his arguments and examining their enduring legacy. Our story begins, not in a laboratory, but on the deck of a ship. The young naturalist Charles Darwin set sail on HMS Beagle in 1831. This was no ordinary voyage. It was a circumnavigation of the globe, a journey that would last for 5 long years and profoundly shape the course of his thinking. As Darwin himself wrote, the voyage was by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career. Darwin wasn't just an observer, he was a meticulous documenter. He filled notebooks with detailed observations. On my return home in the autumn of 1836, he would later write, I immediately began to prepare my journal for publication and then saw how many facts indicated the common descent of species. In July 1837, I opened my first notebook for facts in relation to the origin of species, about which I had long reflected and never ceased working for the next 20 years. 150 to 215. It was on these diverse lands and seas that Darwin had his first true revelations. These facts, he says, especially latter, origin of all my views. He was struck by the strange fossils he uncovered in South America, the wonderful relationship in the same continent of existing and extinct animals, and even more so by the unique and perplexing variations he observed amongst the animals on the Galapagos archipelago. From the finches with their different beak shapes to the tortoises with their varied shell types, the islands seemed to be displaying a perplexing mystery, an enigma that Darwin was determined to solve. He had become, as he puts it himself, greatly struck from about the month of previous March on character of South American fossils and species on Galapagos archipelago. The answer, he sensed, was hidden in the very variations he was recording and a need to connect these dots together. But more than the striking differences between continents, it was the subtle variations he noticed within seemingly identical groups, living just a few miles apart from one another on the isolated islands of the Galapagos, that particularly captivated his mind. He saw finches with beaks of different shapes, suited to different diets. He saw tortoises with shells varying based on the island they inhabited. He saw mockingbirds that seemed to subtly mirror each other across the short straits of the island groups. A question began to echo in his mind. Why do these creatures, so similar yet not identical, exhibit such clear yet slight differences? Why wasn't life a simple, perfect, immutable thing? Why did these tiny changes seem to cluster around geography? The answer, he would ultimately realize, lay not in some inherent or grand design, but in the slow, relentless process he would soon call natural selection. Darwin knew that the sheer diversity of life was not created at once, but was instead a product of time and adaptation. He was acutely aware of how readily domesticated animals and plants varied from their wild ancestors. He observed, when we compare the individuals of the same variety or sub-variety of our older cultivated plants and animals, one of the first points which strikes us is that they generally differ more from each other than do the individuals of any one species or variety in a state of nature. He was also struck by the fact that these domestic forms often had characteristics so extreme they seemed monstrous. The racing greyhound, the short-horned cow, the giant cabbage. These were all human creations, shaped over time from a common stock. But where did this variability come from? He wondered. Is it a function of excess food? Or is it the nature of the organism, or perhaps the nature of the conditions in which they are kept? While he conceded some slight effects of the environment and habit on an organism, Darwin intuited that the process was far more complex than simple inheritance or external factors. He noticed that within any population, some individuals were stronger, faster, produced more milk, or grew more quickly than others. This was not limited to animals. He saw it in plants, too. Some seedlings grew faster, others bore more fruit. It was this observation that revealed the power of breeders. They selected the best for procreation, passing those traits to the next generation. This process, Darwin understood, required two things: careful observation and a kind of sorting mechanism that is if by a natural law. As Darwin himself put it, after reading Malthus on population, it at once struck me that, under these circumstances, favourable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavourable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here then I had at last got a theory by which to work. He realised that the source of variation was not only the environment or a tendency to vary. There had to be something more, some force, a sorting mechanism that selected certain characteristics over others, a force that he was beginning to understand was the primary driver of all the changes he had observed. Darwin was keenly aware that all species, from the smallest insect to the largest mammal, are driven by an almost unstoppable force, the innate biological impulse to reproduce. A single pair of organisms can generate far more offspring than their environment can sustain. Nature, he realized, is a ceaseless engine of reproduction. From this principle emerges a profound reality, the reality Darwin called the struggle for existence. Picture, if you will, a herd of deer. Each generation swells their ranks, and every new birth strains the resources of the forest and pasture. The competition for food, water, and space becomes inevitable. Or imagine a forest floor where countless seeds and seedlings vie for light, for soil, for nutrients. Not all can survive. This is the brutal truth of the natural world. Life is not an endless, harmonious progression, but a fierce battle, a constant struggle to simply exist. And it is within this struggle, this unyielding competition, that Darwin realized the process of selection occurs. Now we arrive at the very heart of Darwin's theory, the mechanism by which evolution occurs, natural selection. Remember the struggle for existence. It is within this constant competition for resources, for survival itself, that the process of selection takes place. It is not the environment that creates variations, rather it is the environment that selects for them. Within any population, there is always a range of individual differences, just as we see in our own families or as Darwin observed in domesticated animals. Slight variations, no matter how subtle, a slight difference in the color of a beetle, a tiny alteration in beak shape, are all subject to the same principle, natural selection. These variations, though seemingly insignificant at first, are the raw material for evolution. Imagine a group of finches. Among them, some have slightly stronger beaks, better suited for cracking tough seeds. Over time, these finches are more likely to survive, more likely to raise their offspring successfully, and thus more likely to pass down that favorable trait. In the next generation, this advantageous trait will appear more frequently, amplifying with each passing generation. Over time, this process transforms a tiny advantage into a defining characteristic. Through this mechanism, organs and traits become more and more finely tuned to their purpose. A slightly longer neck, stretched across millennia, becomes the towering neck of a giraffe. Markings used for camouflage grow ever more precise, conferring better survival against predators. Natural selection is a process of continuous refinement, a relentless sculpting of life by the forces of nature. Darwin emphasized that inheritance was the key to this process. As advantageous variations occur, they are passed from parent to offspring. Generation by generation, these traits become more pronounced until they dominate an entire population. This process, Darwin realized, wasn't simply about survival. It was a mechanism of transformation. A species didn't merely fight to persist, it evolved. Later in his life, Darwin adopted the phrase survival of the fittest, a term that captured this idea. Survival alone wasn't enough. It was about leaving behind progeny that carried those traits forward. In his notebooks and writings, Darwin depicted this process not as a linear ladder of progress, but as a branching tree. Variation and inheritance, he understood, created new and different forms of life. The wings of a bird, he realized, were not unique creations, but modifications of earlier, simpler structures. As he observed, the existence of transitional forms would seem to show that the amount of modification which living beings have undergone during geological time is but very small in relation to the whole series of changes which they have suffered. Over vast geological timescales, these tiny changes, amplified and refined by natural selection, give rise to the incredible diversity of life we see today. Life is not a fixed collection of unchanging species. It is a constantly evolving, interconnected system. Species adapt to the unique conditions of their environments, competing, surviving, and changing. This, then, is Darwin's great insight. Life is a constant process of adaptation, a relentless drive toward diversity, an endless evolution shaped by variation and time. This is evolution in action, a slow, inexorable transformation of life itself. Darwin's theory, though revolutionary and compelling, was not without its challenges. Critics raised several difficult questions. How could something as intricate as a bat's wing or the human eye have arisen through slow, incremental changes? How could the highly specialized social behaviors of insects, like the complex nest building and honey production of bees, or the slave-making instincts of certain ants, have evolved through natural selection? And, perhaps most pressing of all, where were the intermediate forms? Where was the evidence of slow transitions between one species and another in the fossil record? Darwin tackled these objections head-on with remarkable insight. He demonstrated how a shared bone structure, what we now call a homologous structure, could be modified into entirely different forms, such as a hand, a fin, or a wing, each perfectly adapted to its specific function. He explained that even complex organs or behaviors could evolve in small, cumulative steps through natural selection. For instance, the eye might begin as a simple patch of light-sensitive cells, gradually evolving into a more complex and functional organ over time. Darwin also addressed the incomplete nature of the fossil record, emphasizing that many intermediate forms may have existed but were lost to the imperfections of geological preservation. Fossilization, he argued, was a rare event, and the remnants of life's history were fragmented and incomplete. Yet even in his time, enough evidence existed to show transitional forms in many lineages. To explain the evolution of behaviors, Darwin highlighted the difference between function and structure. He argued that similar structures could arise through very different evolutionary paths, adapting to distinct environments. For instance, a bat's wing and a whale's flipper, though vastly different in appearance, shared a common ancestral blueprint. This, Darwin pointed out, was evidence of descent from a single progenitor. He also pointed to the existence of rudimentary organs, vestigial structures like the eyes of blind, cave-dwelling animals. These structures, once functional in an ancestor, now stood as evidence of evolution, illustrating how features could lose their purpose over time as species adapted to new environments. In addressing these criticisms, Darwin not only defended his theory, but strengthened it, showing that natural selection was a process capable of explaining both the complexity and diversity of life. To better explain his theory, Darwin delved into other important areas of biology, such as morphology, the study of the structure and form of organisms. He pointed out the striking similarities of the limb structure in vastly different animals. He then turned to embryology, the study of development. He noted the similarity of embryos early on, suggesting they share a common origin. Even rudimentary organs, those useless parts of an animal or plant, show, he argued, the legacy of descent. These organs are the traces of former needs. They indicate that those forms of life had, at one point, a slightly different shape, he explained. He also emphasized the critical distinction between homologous structures, which are due to shared ancestry, and analogous structures, which develop independently to perform the same function. It is these insights into these separate areas of science that add further weight to his case. If evolution by natural selection is true, then where, critics demanded, were all the missing links, those countless transitional forms which Darwin's theory implied must have existed between all the known species? Where were all the steps between the fish and the amphibians, between the reptiles and the birds, between the apes and mankind? It was a potent criticism because if all life is interconnected, then why don't we see all the evidence of it? Darwin was forced to acknowledge the incompleteness of the geological record. The Earth, he admitted, was not a perfect museum. The chances of an organism being fossilized, its remains being preserved through the ages, of them being found, and lastly of them being recognized were and remain exceedingly slim. The crust of the Earth, he argued, is a vast museum, but the natural collections have been imperfectly made and only at long intervals of time. He knew from the work of geologists that time itself is often distorted by the very nature of geological deposits, with vast gaps between different layers. As he noted, each formation does not mark a new and complete act of creation, but only an occasional scene, taken almost at hazard in an ever slowly changing drama. We see only fragments, partial stories, snapshots from what must have been a continuous and interconnected web of life. But despite the gaps and imperfections in the record, Darwin maintained that the overall pattern, when we step back from examining the individual fragments, becomes overwhelmingly clear. It is a pattern of ancestry, a genealogical relationship between all living things. He imagined a vast tree of life, with species branching out over time, all connected by descent to shared progenitors. Some branches flourishing and diversifying, while others died off and disappeared entirely. It was here that the true power of his view of descent with modification could be seen. He felt that the more we looked, the more we would see that all life is connected, and all life can be traced back with enough resolution to a single source, a source that, while invisible to us, still exerts its influence over all living things through time. These ideas, though once radical, now form the very bedrock of modern evolutionary theory. The idea of the tree of life as a branching, interconnected web of descent is now a cornerstone of the biological sciences. It reveals a slow but majestic story of change, of adaptation, and of the enduring power of life to transform itself over vast eons of time. It is a history written not in stone tablets, but in the very fabric of life itself. Darwin's On the Origin of Species is at its heart more than just a scientific theory. It is a profound shift in how we perceive our place in the world and our relationship to all other living beings. It reveals a reality where the threads of life weave through time, creating an interconnected tapestry that is both ancient and perpetually changing. Natural selection is the hidden force that makes such complexity possible, a force not guided by divine intervention, but by the rigors of existence itself. It is a testament to the power of seemingly small, almost imperceptible variations of countless life forms striving to survive, to reproduce, and ultimately to leave their mark, and to the awe-inspiring diversity of the living world. From the tiniest flower to the largest whale, from the most fleeting insect to the most enduring tree, the natural world is a masterpiece painted with the brushstrokes of time and evolution. While we may never fully unravel all the intricacies of this magnificent process, while there will always be some facets that remain opaque to human comprehension, the foundations laid by Darwin over a century and a half ago continue to illuminate our understanding of the natural world and of ourselves. And just as all life on Earth is interconnected, so too are we connected to that past, to those forms which came before, and to the future which we will shape. This, then, is the grand legacy of the origin of species, the knowledge that we, like all other beings, have been created by and have become one with the forces of nature.